So a couple weeks ago, I finished Karl Knausgaard's The Morning Star, which is 700 pages, and apparently only the first in a trilogy because Knausgaard cannot write short books. I enjoyed parts of it, but it really did get me thinking about writing and the editing process and how, as writers become more successful, their books tend to bloat quite a bit, and the editor doesn't seem to have as big of an impact as earlier in their careers. And I know Knausgaard is not known for writing short books, but this book really gave me that feeling of someone who's just writing to write and not really sure what he's trying to say and trying to figure it out as he goes along. He's just putting words down on the page and hinting at something larger, but there isn't that tightness that an editor can bring, and really a conversation that editors can bring to this, because books are interesting because they are one of the art forms that brings us closest to the internal thoughts of a single person. Movies have a whole crew behind them. Art is a lot more abstract, especially visual art, whereas books, they're words, they're language, they're a communication, and they're from usually a singular author. But with the writing process, usually there's an editor that the writer is bouncing things off of, that's telling them to change this or that, or how to focus things or change things. And I feel as authors become more successful, they don't do that as much. And so you're getting more of the unfiltered thoughts, but I'm not sure it's necessarily a good thing. I think the author that most people would be familiar with this is J.K. Rowling and the Harry Potter series. What you may think of Rowling becoming a horrible bigot later, the books themselves are interesting in this example that I'm thinking of, where originally it started out as these tight young adult novels, and then as Rowling became more successful and as her audience aged, they ended up becoming a lot larger and bloated. And part of that might have been the audience changing, but I think part of that was just no one saying no to Rowling. These books ended up becoming so big that they split the last Harry Potter movie into two movies because there was just so much in the books, and they don't really work nearly as well as they did when they were short, tight, young adult novels. And I sort of feel the same for Knausgaard, where he's just not being told no enough to be like, what is the point of this work, this art that you're creating? Why do you want to do it? Are you just doing it to put words down on the page because now you've moved on? My Struggle, which I still have not read. I don't know if I will read, just because I don't know if his style necessarily agrees with me, and I tend to like fiction that's more fictional than autofiction, but I feel that a lot when authors become really big, they don't do as much. I think an interesting example of this would be Mircea Cartarescu's Solenoid, which was actually one of my favorite books that I read last year, but it did suffer a bit from this. And because Cartarescu's book, as very prominently featured, said this is a first draft, there were no further revisions to this, which was just written down as a wall of text and moved forward. And so there was a lot of repetition. There was things that could be tighter, even though the ideas were really interesting. This Bucharest, which was rotting from the bottom on up, and all of this mysticism and bigotry and cruelty and just pain and despair, but in a really interesting, magical way. I think it could have been tighter if it had had an editor, and maybe if Cartarescu had been a young author starting up. Of course, you have counterexamples. For instance, say Jack Kerouac's On the Road, which is famously just written on one log sheet of paper, or John Kennedy O'Toole's Confederacy of Dungeons, which famously just bounced around editors who kept telling him no, he had to change this or that. It was only after his death that his mother convinced a publisher to publish it as is, and it became a major novel, even though, again, I think some of those editors might have been right that there could have been things cut down from this sprawling comic novel, which a lot of people like. I thought it was just okay. It could have been tighter. But some of this is also hard to separate from just artists aging. I know Rushdie's books haven't bloated nearly as much, but he hasn't really written anything all that interesting in the last few decades of his career. I think Shalimar the Clown is a magnum opus from his sort of mid-career, but everything I've read says hasn't really worked. And so I think it might be hard to separate this editor and author together from maybe just an author aging and running out of interesting things to say. And I know there is always criticism in literature of later works, whether they become derivative. I know a lot of stereotypes of poets is that a lot of their best work is done in their teens and 20s, which I think is very unfair, but Hemingway famously struggled to write things, and The Old Man and the Sea barely even qualifies, I think, as a novella. And so it is an interesting conversation as to whether authors become successful and just end up pumping things out that the editors can't say no to. I know Stephen King famously just writes forever and ever, and a lot of his recent stuff hasn't been great, but I mean, all of his stuff tends to suffer from that thing of not really having an ending in mind and him just writing to write. And earlier on in his career, I think editors might have been able to bring him back and move him forward, but currently he's just sort of pumping out things that people eat up and have their good ideas, but again, lack that tightness. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting problem of books being such a small artistic endeavor where it is someone just putting words down on a page, usually a small team telling them yes or no. But as they get bigger, sometimes they just put everything out on the page, and maybe their work suffers for that because you do need those people to bounce things off of. You do need that fear of failure, and when you become really successful, maybe you believe some of your own hype and you don't create that art that should be there. I think you need someone to put strictures on your creative endeavor, and I think Knausgaard has been very successful in just his graphomania of writing as much as possible, and I don't think it works as well in a novel form because I was reading The Morning Star and I read it and I said, okay, what next? What else? And it's like, oh, there are two more 700-page novels to really fill in the gaps here. And I thought, you know what? I don't think it's actually worthwhile to move that forward because this man is obviously just writing to write. There seems to be a mystery and appreciation around really long works of literature. I know Proust's In Search of Lost Time is famous for just being a sprawling meditative masterpiece, which I have read and enjoyed. And I think the length works for that book because, again, it is more grounded in memory and revisiting the past. Whereas in Knausgaard's novel, that's just more of a novel struggling with contemporary themes and doesn't have that hypnotic meditation that I think works for Proust. And it only works in very specific areas. And I think people should value conciseness and they should value working with someone else to structure their art, to say something that they really feel is important, rather than just setting words down on the page as they've grown older and as they think they just have to keep pumping out books, because books are special. I think readers have limited amounts of time, and you should treat that as an important conversation as you move forward. And unfortunately, I don't think Knausgaard's The Morning Star works as a novel just because he's not being bound by anything other than his own need to write. Let me know what you think. I might be off base here, but I think editors are very important and they should be valued more, especially by the famous authors that are ignoring them.